A big update for you now from Arlington police. A suspect involved in a 2012 cold case has been arrested. Mayra Velasquez has been charged with capital murder by terror threat.
Irasema Chavez was stabbed more than 100 times inside her own apartment, and for 14 years, not a single person was charged. A drop of blood left behind at that scene never matched a name in any law enforcement database, until this year, when investigators say they matched it to DNA lifted off a discarded plastic fork. The woman now charged with capital murder was, according to Arlington police, once a close friend of the victim, someone who had been inside that apartment before, more than once. And right now, as this video is being made, that woman is walking around free on a $450,000 bond, wearing an ankle monitor and stripped of her passport, after a judge sided with her attorney's argument that denying her bond in the first place was unconstitutional.
I am Mayra Velasquez. I did not do this. I will never do this to anyone. I'm a good person. She was my friend. I know God and all those people who know me, they know that I couldn't never do something like this to anyone.
While investigators admit they still don't have a clear, confirmed answer for why any of this happened. Every one of those threads is going to come apart and come back together in this video. And if a case where the break came 14 years late is the kind of investigation you want walked through in full, this is exactly the ongoing work this channel exists to do. So if you're new here, subscribing means you're signing up to follow this case, and every case like it, through to wherever it actually ends. Let's start with who Irasema Chavez was, because the coverage of this case, understandably, has spent most of its time on the woman who was arrested. Chavez was 32 years old in January of 2012, living in a second-floor unit at the Aspenwood Apartments in the 2700 block of South Collins Street in Arlington, Texas. Some reporting has referred to her by the surname Chavez Sanchez, and it's worth being upfront that outlets have used both versions of her name. This narration will use Irasema Chavez, the name most consistently used by police and national coverage. What's confirmed is where she lived, how old she was, and that her family remained close to her, some of them in Nuevo León, Mexico, where her sisters were living at the time this case broke back open. What's not confirmed, and what police have said outright they still don't know, is a motive. Keep that in mind, because it's going to matter more the further into this you get. Chavez's family has spoken publicly since the arrest, though carefully. Her sisters, speaking with NBC5 from Nuevo León, Mexico, days after the arrest was announced, told reporters they did not personally know Mayra Velasquez, a detail that stands in contrast to the arrest affidavit's characterization of the two women as, in its own words, very close friends. That's not necessarily a contradiction. A family member not recognizing a name doesn't mean a friendship didn't exist. It may simply mean that part of Chavez's life wasn't one she'd shared with relatives living hundreds of miles away. But it's a discrepancy worth naming rather than smoothing over, because it's exactly the kind of detail that a defense team can be expected to raise at trial. What the family did say, according to that same report, is that they were praying for Velasquez's own family, even while hoping for what they called justice for Chavez. That's a specific, on-the-record reaction, not a paraphrase of general grief. And it's worth noting because it's a notably restrained response from a family that waited 14 years for any name at all. On the morning of January 20th, 2012, according to police, a niece who had been dropped off to spend the day with Chavez found her unresponsive inside the apartment's kitchen, just before 9 a.m. Chavez was pronounced dead at the scene. The Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office ruled it a homicide, and the number that's been repeated across nearly every outlet covering this case is 100. The medical examiner determined Chavez had been stabbed more than 100 times. That is not a rounded estimate for dramatic effect. It's the figure investigators and reporters have used consistently since 2012. And it is one of the first things that should tell you this wasn't a robbery that went sideways in a panic. There is a difference between violence that ends a threat and violence that goes on long after the threat is over, and a stab count in the triple digits sits firmly in the second category. That distinction is going to come back later in this video because of what it implies about who Chavez likely knew and how she likely died. Here's the first real turning point, and it's one that sat unresolved for over a decade. There were no signs of forced entry into Chavez's apartment. Investigators have said publicly that this raised the strong possibility she knew whoever killed her, or that she opened the door for them willingly. Add to that a detail from surveillance footage. The night before Chavez was found, a security camera captured someone in baggy clothing and a hoodie climbing the stairs toward her unit. Police released that footage back in 2012, hoping the public could identify the person. Nobody ever did. And here's a detail that's easy to skip past but shouldn't be. Chavez's television had been stolen from the apartment. On the surface, that reads like a robbery, but investigators, both in 2012 and now, have treated the missing TV as a secondary detail rather than a motive, because 100+ stab wounds inside a home with no forced entry doesn't read like someone who broke in to steal an appliance and panicked. It reads like something closer, angrier, and far more personal, and for 14 years, police had no name to put to that anger. That's because of what happened, or rather didn't happen, with the one piece of physical evidence they did have. Investigators recovered a drop of blood from a TV stand at the scene. Some reporting places it in the bedroom, some in the living room, but all reporting agrees it did not belong to Chavez. That blood was tested against national criminal databases in 2012. It came back with no match. All investigators could determine from it, for the next 14 years, was that it belonged to a Hispanic woman. That's it. That's the entire profile of a suspect that Arlington police carried for over a decade. An unidentified Hispanic woman, walking free, somewhere. In 2012, detectives even worked with the Virginia-based lab Parabon Nanolabs to build a composite facial profile from the DNA. It generated no leads. Ask yourself, before we go further, if you were the detective sitting on a blood sample that told you almost nothing for over a decade, would you have kept pursuing it, or would you have let it join the pile of cold cases every department eventually stops actively working? Leave your answer in the comments, because Arlington's homicide unit made a choice here that the rest of this video is going to test. This is where the case sat, essentially frozen, until November of 2024. Arlington's homicide unit doesn't have dedicated cold case detectives. Cold cases get picked up by homicide investigators in the gaps between active work. But in that month, the department met with the FBI's Dallas field office specifically to talk about using investigative genetic genealogy on the Chavez case. It's worth being precise about what that technology actually does, because it's central to how this case broke, and because it gets misunderstood. Investigative genetic genealogy takes unidentified crime scene DNA and cross-references it against genealogical databases and publicly available historical records, birth records, family trees, the kind of documentation people upload when they're researching their own ancestry, to build outward from unknown DNA toward a family tree, and eventually toward a name. It does not identify a suspect directly from a database hit the way a traditional criminal DNA match does. It finds relatives first, then narrows. By April of 2026, according to the FBI, that process had produced a result. It identified Mayra Velasquez, then 42 years old, as a potential suspect. That's a critical word, potential. A genetic genealogy lead is an investigative direction, not proof, and Arlington police treated it that way. In May of 2026, according to the arrest affidavit as reported by WFAA, undercover detectives followed Velasquez to a lunch and afterward collected items she had used and discarded, 2 plastic forks and some dishes, according to that reporting. That DNA was sent to a crime lab. Detectives say it matched the blood droplet from the 2012 crime scene. Now here's where this case demands a second pass through the same information, because the story so far has been told in order. 2012, then 2024, then 2026. But it changes when you walk through it again, asking a different question. Not what happened, but who Velasquez actually was in relation to Chavez the entire time this investigation was running cold. According to Arlington police, Mayra Velasquez was, in their words, at one time a close friend of Irasema Chavez, and she lived just a few miles from the crime scene. Detective Tracy Dixon told reporters Velasquez had been inside Chavez's apartment before, not as a stranger who'd wandered in once, but as someone with a documented history in that space. And Dixon has said Chavez's own cell phone data became a valuable source of information about their relationship, without elaborating publicly on what that data showed. So rerun the timeline through that lens. For 14 years, investigators weren't searching for an anonymous woman off the street. They were, unknowingly, sitting a few miles away from someone who had a name, a history with the victim, and, according to the affidavit, DNA already inside their case file the entire time, just unidentified. The gap wasn't in the evidence. The gap was in the technology needed to read it. That's the same fact you heard in the open about a blood drop with no match, reworded now with everything you know. A blood sample sat in an evidence locker for 14 years, waiting only for a lab process that didn't exist yet to catch up with a person who, police say, was never far away to begin with. Velasquez was arrested without incident in Hurst, Texas, on July 17, 2026. Some early reporting lists July 16th, tied to when the warrant itself was issued, but the arrest occurred July 17. That is 14 years, 5 months, and 27 days after Arlington police allege she killed Irasema Chavez. She was booked into the Tarrant County Corrections Center and charged with capital murder. Specifically, according to jail records, capital murder in the course of committing or attempting a robbery, tying back to that stolen television. At the time of her arrest, Velasquez was working as a real estate agent in North Texas, listed with Pure Realtors LLC, with an active Texas real estate license. A work acquaintance told Kara News that Velasquez seemed like a kind, family-oriented person who had done well professionally and traveled often to visit family abroad, and that acquaintance said she was shocked by the arrest, adding she believed anyone who knew Velasquez would be. That's not a confirmed fact about Velasquez's character, to be clear. That's one person's account of their impression of her, and it's being labeled as exactly that. Here's a detail that has drawn real public attention, and it needs the same careful labeling. Social media posts on Velasquez's accounts, reviewed and reported on by Fox News Digital, showed her on trips to Peru, Mexico, Paris, and London in the years following Chavez's death, smiling, traveling, living what looked from the outside like an ordinary, full life. None of that is evidence of guilt or innocence on its own. People who have nothing to do with an unsolved crime travel and smile in photos, and if Velasquez did commit this crime, the reality is that plenty of people accused of serious crimes go on living ordinary lives for years, sometimes decades, before anything catches up to them. The photos are being raised here because they are part of the public record and the public conversation around this case, not because they prove anything about what happened inside that apartment in January of 2012. It's worth pausing here on the legal terminology, because it matters for what happens next in this case. Velasquez wasn't charged with murder in the general sense. She was charged with capital murder, and in Texas, that's a distinct classification, not just a harsher label for the same crime. Capital murder applies when a killing happens alongside certain other specific circumstances, in this case allegedly during the commission of a robbery, tied to Chavez's stolen television. Jail records list the charge specifically as capital murder by terror threat, other felony. That distinction matters because a capital murder charge in Texas can, depending on how prosecutors choose to pursue it, carry the possibility of the death penalty or life without parole, a different legal track entirely from a standard murder charge, and one that shapes everything from bond decisions to how a defense team builds its strategy from day one. At her first court appearance, a judge ordered Velasquez held without bond. Her attorney, Dustin Hoffman of the Sellers law firm, said publicly that the firm intended to release a fuller statement and stated directly, in his own words, that what I can tell you right now is that Ms. Velasquez, Mayra, is completely innocent of this. That is a direct quote from Velasquez's attorney, not a finding of any court, and it's being presented as exactly that, an attorney's public position on behalf of his client. Velasquez's defense responded by filing a writ of habeas corpus, arguing the no-bond order itself was unconstitutional. According to that filing, Velasquez has zero prior criminal history and has been, in the words of the motion itself, a benefit, not a danger, to her community in the 14 years since Chavez's death, and her attorneys asked that bond be set below $100,000. A judge didn't go that low, but did rule in the defense's favor on the core question. Bond was granted at $450,000, and Velasquez posted it, walking out of the Tarrant County Jail this past Wednesday, July 29. She was fitted with an ankle monitor and required to surrender her passport, among other release conditions. That release is worth sitting with, because it tells you the defense's constitutional argument had real weight with at least one judge, even if it says nothing yet about guilt or innocence. And her attorneys haven't stopped at procedure. They've started attacking the physical evidence directly. According to Cara News, the defense has pointed out that Velasquez was, by her own account and the account of police, a regular visitor to Chavez's apartment, which means finding her DNA there isn't inherently suspicious on its own. The argument is that a friend's blood at a scene she frequented doesn't automatically prove she was there the night of the murder. The defense has also taken specific issue with how investigators described that blood droplet in the original 2012 case file as fresh and glistening when Chavez's body was found, despite that discovery happening nearly 10 hours after the medical examiner estimates she was killed. If blood that old wouldn't still look fresh and glistening, the defense's implicit argument is that either the droplet got there separately from the killing itself, or the original crime scene description doesn't hold up under scrutiny. For its part, the arrest affidavit offers its own explanation for whose blood it likely was, stating that it's common for an attacker to cut themselves while stabbing someone as many times as Chavez was stabbed. Separately, her attorneys have also argued that the 2012 surveillance footage of the hooded figure climbing the stairs doesn't physically match their client's description at all, a direct challenge to the one piece of visual evidence police have held onto since the very beginning. There's also, finally, something resembling a motive, though it needs the same careful labeling as everything else here. According to the arrest warrant affidavit obtained by Cara News, police allege that Velasquez's husband was jealous of the two women's close relationship around the time Chavez was killed. That is an allegation contained in a police affidavit, not a fact established at trial, and it doesn't specify what role, if any, that jealousy is alleged to have played in the killing itself. But it is the first concrete motive thread that surfaced publicly in this case, after weeks of police saying they simply didn't have one. Arlington police have also stated they believe Velasquez acted alone and are not seeking any other suspects, which, if that jealousy detail is relevant at all, raises its own question the investigation hasn't answered. What a husband's alleged jealousy would have to do with a killing police say his wife committed by herself. So where does that leave the case for the prosecution? According to Detective Tracy Dixon, the DNA match is not the only piece of evidence investigators plan to bring to trial. Dixon told reporters at a news conference that detectives also have data from Chavez's cell phone and statements Chavez herself made to police during an interview at some point before her death, though Dixon did not elaborate on the content of either. That's an important thing to sit with. There is reportedly evidence beyond the DNA, but the public record right now doesn't tell us what that evidence actually says, only that it exists and that prosecutors consider it significant enough to mention at a news conference. If you had to guess what a friend might have told police about Chavez in an interview before her death that ends up mattering 14 years later, what do you think it could be? Drop your theory in the comments, because the honest answer is that nobody outside that investigation currently knows, and that gap is exactly where this case still has room to move. Let's take one more pass through this. A second dual-lens replay, this time asking who benefited and who had access, rather than just what the evidence shows. Access is the clearer of the two. Police say Velasquez had been inside Chavez's apartment before, which explains the lack of forced entry far more plainly than a stranger ever could. A close friend doesn't need to break in. A close friend gets let in, gets handed a normal evening, and, if the allegation is true, turns it into something else entirely. Benefit is murkier, and this is where the case is genuinely still open. There's no confirmed financial motive reported. There's no confirmed love triangle or custody dispute reported. Investigators have said outright the motive is unclear. What we're left with, reading the case through this lens, is a relationship close enough to explain the access, and a violence level, over 100 stab wounds, that typically speaks to something far more personal than a robbery gone wrong, even though robbery is the specific charge tied to the stolen television. Those two things, the intimacy implied by the access and the rage implied by the wound count, don't fully explain each other yet. That tension is, right now, the actual center of this case. That tension is also the same thread running underneath everything covered so far. A blood sample too small and too anonymous to convict anyone in 2012 became, 14 years later, the exact thing that named a woman police say was the victim's own friend, and it's a friendship, not a stranger's crime, that may end up explaining a killing brutal enough to have looked, on the surface, like the work of someone with no connection to Chavez at all. Before closing this out, it's worth pulling back from Velasquez and Chavez specifically, because this case sits inside a larger pattern that true crime coverage doesn't always name directly. Arlington's police department, like most municipal departments its size, does not have detectives whose full-time job is cold cases. Those cases get worked in whatever time homicide investigators have left over from active ones. That raises a real question that has nothing to do with guilt or innocence in this specific case. How many other unsolved homicides, in Arlington and departments like it, are sitting on evidence that simply hasn't caught up with the technology yet? Investigative genetic genealogy is still a resource-heavy, case-by-case process, not something departments can run automatically on every unsolved file. So the open questions this case leaves behind aren't just about Mayra Velasquez. They're about how many cold cases get reopened only when a department happens to have the staffing, the funding, and the specific will to send a 14-year-old blood sample back out for another look, and how many never do. As of this recording, Mayra Velasquez is out of custody on that $450,000 bond, wearing an ankle monitor, her passport surrendered, awaiting whatever comes next. Tarrant County court records don't yet show a scheduled trial date. The case remains active. Her attorney's constitutional rights argument already succeeded once with a judge on the bond question, and the specific motive behind Irasema Chavez's death has gone from completely unknown to, at best, a single disputed allegation involving a jealous husband that police haven't tied together in any public explanation. What's confirmed is a blood drop that sat unmatched in an evidence file for over 14 years. What's now alleged, but not yet proven in any courtroom, is that the woman it belonged to was someone Chavez had once called a close friend, and what's now being fought over, blood droplet by blood droplet, is whether that friendship is the reason the DNA was there at all, or the reason it doesn't prove anything. Whether a jury ultimately agrees that friendship explains what happened inside that apartment in January of 2012 is the one part of this story that hasn't been written yet. If you had to bet on what finally comes out at trial, the phone data, the interview statements, or that jealousy allegation the affidavit raised but never explained, which one do you think breaks this case wide open? Let us know in the comments, and if you want to be here when that answer actually comes, subscribing keeps you following this one through to the verdict.